Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the MPMA and Assessments collaboration for this webinar entitled From Survival to Thrival Beyond the Multipolar Gates of Hormuz. Can you jump to the next slide, please? Let me read out the webinar etiquette before we get things moving. We have muted and turned off video of all the participants to ensure no disruptions throughout the webinar. Participants may post their questions related to the presentation in the chat box during the webinar. The speaker will only answer questions that are clearly written and those based on the presentation. Kindly refrain from marketing your goods or services in the chat box as it is only meant for queries related to the presentation. And the organizer reserves the right to remove participants who run afoul of the webinar etiquette. Okay, next slide, please. Before we begin the seminar proper, can we ask everybody to put on your video so that we can take a group photograph? Is everybody on? Sujata, yes. Is everybody on? I think got some people still haven't put on their video. Can we have those? Can everybody please put on your video for a group photograph? Still, there are some people who haven't put on your video. Can we have everybody to put on your video for a group photograph? I still see a number who have not put on their video for the group photograph. Sujata, should we take the group photograph? Okay, yeah. Okay, let me give the cue to everybody. Nick, are you ready for the group photograph? Ever ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Punita, you taking the photograph, huh? Punita. Okay. Let's take another one, huh?
I'm done already. I've taken the photograph. All good.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Can we jump to the next slide, please? Okay. Before we begin the speaker will do the presentation, let me introduce our speaker for this afternoon. He is Mr. F. Nixick, or we call him Nick. Hope I got it correct, Nick. Nick is a business leader with nearly 3 decades of experience in management consulting, trading, and training across Asia. Based in Kuala Lumpur since 1993, he has worked extensively across the region in the energy, oil and gas, petrochemicals, and plastics sectors. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Assessments Sendirian Berhad, a global business services and analytics firm providing pricing intelligence, news, and knowledge process outsourcing for the energy and petrochemical industries. He also founded Sustainable Asia Plans Sendirian Berhad, which specializes in market studies and industry training. Previously, he established the Southeast Asia office of Chem Orbis in Kuala Lumpur and later led its Asia Pacific and India operations. Earlier in his career, he co-managed a family business involved in turnkey power and communication projects, including feasibility studies that supported major contracts with TNB, Tenaga Nasional Berhad. And without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to invite MPMA's friend, Nick, to begin. Nick?
Okay, thank you, Francis, and thank you, MPMA, for having me. And without much ado, let me just try to share my slides. I hope that everybody is able to see my slides. And okay, so we had like 1 week to put the slides together. And the purpose of the slides is actually to demonstrate 3 things. what's happening with Hormuz, when we actually say Hormuz, it became a synonym for big changes in the Middle East. In the case, I have actually added Bab el Mandeb because I think soon we will be seeing quite a bit of news regarding Bab el Mandeb. And then the second, we will give introduction. We call it causes, effects, outlook. Other than the Hormuz, what's happening globally, what's happening in the market. And then finally, I want to focus, and this is how we started actually the whole idea about this webinar. I want to focus on Malaysia 39. And of course, 39 stands for Hedges Code 39. And it includes everything from raw materials to plastic end products. And we will share some slides and in everything that is happening, try to understand what is the best way forward for Malaysian companies and how to utilize all the opportunities which are actually being presented, intertwined with challenges right now, right? So this is, I will first say it because we really don't cover politics, but these days it has become quite impossible to cover the energy and chemicals markets without actually talking about geopolitics. So for us, we have customers globally. We do have customers both in Ukraine and Russian Federation. We have customers across Middle East, and we plan to continue having customers everywhere. So we don't take any sides in any conflicts. We are actually really interested in business, and I think everybody attending this webinar is actually interested in attending business and making money, right? I mean, doing it in a sustainable way, doing it in a way that benefits everybody involved in the business deal, and we love everybody, we treat everybody with respect. So this is important because there will be quite a number of things that we will discuss today, right? So again, agenda, Hormuz digest, and whatever happening in Red Sea, causes, effects, and outlook. We call it CEO assessments. It's a catchy title. And then Malaysia 3. And let's just, to put some things into perspective, we will actually give some idea what was happening before conflict between, let's say, Iran, Israel, and United States started. So we were seeing some trends happening before, and I always like to use this quote from Saudi Arabian oil minister. He actually made this comment in 2008 when the crude oil was reaching 150 per barrel, and he said it and he meant it. That's not good for Saudi Arabia because eventually once crude oil is at USD 150 per barrel, then a lot of other energies which are normally not profitable or technologies or ways that we can move forward were not making sufficient return on investments to compete with the crude oil. But once crude oil was at 150, shale oil picked up quite a bit in the United States, renewables, etc. And then now we have much wider choice when it comes to energy. And the question is still being asked, when are we going to hit peak oil? And some commentators will say, look, this actually Hormuz crisis will bring the peak oil because there are renewables and electric vehicles adoption. Essentially, a lot of things are happening right now, not even due to the price of the crude oil, but to the fact that we simply can't get it as long as the conflict happens in Hormuz, right? And I want to say another thing, and we have made this slide in 2022 when actually sanctions were being implemented and against the Russian Federation and so on after conflict in Ukraine have started. And the thing about sanctions, they are forming a big part of where we are today. So I just wanted to include these slides. Every time let's say Iran was under sanctions for endless number of years, and has Iran emerged weaker or stronger, right? I mean, or once you have sanctions and you don't allow countries to use US dollars, then they will use whatever else they can use. And then sometimes those trends become irreversible. And that is all bringing us to this new multipolar world. And again, the reason we are discussing what's going on right now, the world is obviously changing. So how are we going to make it the best we can for our own business? And in this case, I'm doing this webinar for Malaysia Manufacturers, Plastic Manufacturers Association, of course, how Malaysian companies can actually benefit from whatever is going on. So this slide about supply chains, this is valid before the conflict has started. So there are few simultaneous attempts, and all of it is actually done because some countries would like to become bigger and more important players. So one of the options was, okay, to use Iraq port in Basra, then use whatever infrastructure is available through Iraq, then through Turkey, and then through Turkey on to EU. And the competition to that project was actually the Peace Railway that, let's say, skipping totally the Suez Canal and this Red Sea, companies would actually offload their containers in Abu Dhabi. Then it would go by train, and the railway actually already was being built, and through Saudi Arabia, and then to Israeli port of Haifa, so via Saudi Arabia and Jordan. And of course, that was when you hear this, let's say, Abraham Accords or whatever. So beyond the political, there is always economic component. And again, this is why we have to discuss geopolitics. And then North Sea route, since we have a global warming, so ice is shrinking, China has started utilizing the northern routes from northern Chinese ports to Europe. And actually, this is ongoing. And then, of course, as a part of the supply chain, what China has been building for years is a one belt, one road. And I don't call it one road, one belt, one road. Actually, it's ecosystem, the ecosystem that China is building, so it can both procure whatever they need to procure and also sell whatever they produce. So this is actually ongoing before Hormuz, and then let's say Saudi Arabians, they have started building the pipes and built some pipes from one side of the country to another side of the country to be able to have multiple choices of shipping. So this was happening before, and this will continue to develop regardless whatever is the outcome of Hormuz, right? But a quick look to understand what's happening with energy. So number one, energy consumption is going up, right? And I don't know whether you can see it on the right here, but the whole purpose of this slide is to show that when you see this yellow line, this is actually China, and the consumption of energy in China is going up. And I have included in the slide global, China, and US. And you can easily see that let's say US and China, of course, are the biggest consumers of energy, but you can see that the Chinese growth, the yellow line, is actually much faster than the green line, which is US consumption of energy. So if you want to see how the economy is actually doing, so there are multiple things. We can look at the GDP, we can look at power purchasing parity, etc. But I would say that simple way, you can't do anything without energy, whether it's transportation, whether it's a feedstock. So you can pretty much gauge the health of the economy just by looking whether the energy consumption is growing or not. So global is growing, China is actually growing, the consumption is growing very fast, US is actually growing slower. And then talking about this replacement of the fossil fuels, you can read a lot of news how electric vehicles adoption and now renewables count for, I don't know, how many percent of the energy used for electric vehicles, etc. But the purpose of this slide, again, just to quickly show that we can't, there is no way that the world, because there is no way that the world is going to get rid of the consumption of fossil fuels anytime soon. So even though the contribution of renewables, etc., is growing, we are that will mainly cover the aggregate growth in demand, and we will still continue to use the fossil fuels. So Hormuz is still going to remain relevant for a while. And a quick example of what's happening when country is actually shrinking, when economy is shrinking, demand for energy is shrinking. We know this is happening in Japan, and we can actually clearly see in 2011 when they have shut down their nuclear plants that actually their local production went down as well. But what is actually more surprising than Japan is Germany, and the big part of the topic today would be about EU. And this is why I'm bringing this slide. So let's say Germany is really the powerhouse of Europe, and the shrinking energy consumption in Germany is really not a good sign for the European economy. So this is just indication of that, again, because we will eventually come to the EU when we talk about Malaysia 39. Then Venezuela, I'm bringing Venezuela because obviously, if you read the news 1 month before the Hormuz happened, then Venezuela has happened. And Venezuela and Iran have some of the biggest crude oil and gas reserves in the world, but particularly crude oil. And the Venezuela probably has the biggest, but there are some arguments over this. And then the purpose of this slide is to show that Venezuela petroleum production kept steadily decreasing over the years, and it will take a lot of investments to actually bring this production back to some level where it can really influence whatever is happening with supply and demand currently. And unfortunately, during the recent earthquakes, we have noticed that some of the survivors have to be digged out by hands because locally the fuel is not even available to power the machines needed to help the survivors of the earthquake. So actually Venezuela is just slightly exceeding current production, is slightly exceeding its actually demand for energy, right? And of course, if Venezuela economy is to restart, then you can expect Venezuela demand for energy to boom. So what does it mean? Is Venezuela one way or the other going to be that great net exporter that maybe somebody in the United States government would want? I'm really not sure. So Iran wants to go nuclear, right? So we have heard this political discussion about Iran wanting to go nuclear to produce nuclear weapons. But to me, it's clear from this slide that, okay, and this is all happening with sanctions. So let's remember, this is all happening with sanctions. So Iran is a country of 100 million people. They are consuming energy, they're producing energy. Of course, if the sanctions are removed, then Iranian demand is supposed to pick up, demand for energy, and then how quickly facilities can be actually put in place, produce more and so on. So one of the reasons, obviously, Iran wants to actually rely more on nuclear energy is to be able to monetize most of its crude and oil, because that is the main source of the foreign currency, the revenue from overseas revenue, right? So this is, other than the political issues, actually make case for Iran to go nuclear. And this is the same reason why Saudi Arabians, they actually want to have more solar or other energy sources, because a lot of their crude oil and gas production is simply going to the air conditioning during the summer. So this is actually a clear case to me. But I'm showing this slide again to show if Iran actually sanctions are being removed, then Iran economy is going to pick up. If Iran economy is going to pick up, it will take some big investments for Iran to actually be able to produce more. And then, okay, why suddenly are we looking at ethane? So we are looking at ethane to show that, okay, talking about feedstocks, talking about the crude oil, ethane has emerged as one of the main feedstocks, particularly for polyethylene. But I want to show that the price of the ethane in the United States and price of ethane in China is actually quite different, which is obvious from this slide. And this slide will be important when we discuss how much of the replacements for missing supplies can be provided, for the raw materials can be provided by China. So exactly how does China make cost-competitive raw material supply to the global markets? Ethane as a feedstock has actually increased greatly, and almost everybody is trying to use ethane. We are now seeing SCG PTT in Thailand announcing they will move to ethane cracking. They are trying to import ethane, make facilities, etc. And the reason I'm bringing these slides because when we discuss Malaysian producers, etc., is the impact of what's going on globally, and this is even regardless of Hormuz, the oversupply for crude oil and for most of the polymers actually started before the crisis in Hormuz. So we are looking at a steady downtrend in terms of pricing, and everybody was trying to use the most competitive feedstocks. And then now we come to Hormuz Digest and Bab El Mandeb choke points or funnels of the futures. So for somebody, these are really the gates because while the process of multipolar world really emerged at that moment when China overtook United States in terms of energy consumption, which was somewhere in 2017, what will be written probably in the history as a major change will be this 2026 Hormuz crisis. And the same like the British dominance ended up with the Suez crisis in 50s. Now the US dominance is in a way being challenged and ending with the Hormuz crisis in 26. But what are the impacts? Again, we are not really interested in politics. We are discussing all of this to understand what is happening and how will this impact Malaysian companies. Number one, like MOU has been signed, right? But what does it really mean? It means nothing. It's actually, I was trying to think of the best way to describe it. So it's like me and my wife, we had arguments. And we were throwing plates, wine bottles, glasses at each other for a few months. And then me and my wife decided that we want to stop fighting and have some ceasefire and agree on a couple of things and then start negotiating how to bring our future together. And we signed an agreement, right? MOU. But the main problem in this is that my girlfriend and my wife's boyfriend have not signed any agreement, right? So there are multiple parties involved, and every party has their own interests. So I will mention some of those parties here. Again, I am not saying who is the bad, who is good. Of course, it will depend from which perspective you're looking at it. So there's no good or bad. Every country is trying to assert their rights, their sovereignty, and whoever has more power will eventually try to negotiate a better deal. So now we have a situation where we are talking about a ceasefire, but we have ongoing conflict in Lebanon. So even the Lebanon conflict was included in MOU between Iran and US, but now there is another agreement basically signed between Lebanon and Israel, which is allowing that conflict to continue. And the Syria conflict supposedly ended, but somehow there are still a lot of things going on in Syria. But I would say the most important conflict to look at right now is actually what's happening in Yemen. So during the conflict, let's say between US, Israel, and Iran, Houthis have in Yemen have remained mostly quiet. And why am I mentioning Houthis? If you remember, there was a conflict and there was ongoing war in Yemen, which actually was also like ended up with some ceasefire, that at one point Houthis have actually launched missiles and taken out 5 out of 10 million barrels, which is basically 5% of the global supply of crude oil, just with a few missiles or drones or whatever they have used. And so the conflict was between, at that time, Saudis and UAE, let's say on one side, together with the, let's say, official government, as they call it in Yemen, against Houthis. But then in the meantime, UAE actually started arming another faction in this in Yemen, which ended up in Saudis actually bombing the weapons supply delivered by UAE. So then after that, UAE has quickly exited Yemen, but soon after, UAE also has exited OPEC. So now we talk about GCC, which is Gulf countries, but UAE, as a result of not only Hormuz, but the result of whatever was happening in December last year, UAE is no longer part of OPEC. And of course, why is this important? So UAE now is not limited by any of the OPEC quotas, and they probably think that even at the lower crude oil prices, they can increase their production and they can supply more to the global market. So this is why this is important more in terms of business. And what has happened now that the conflict has wound down between Iran and US, Saudis and Houthis have in a way renewed the conflict in Yemen. And why is this again important? Because if Houthis close that Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which is basically Red Sea and going to Suez, then this was the channel the Saudis were using while the Hormuz was closed. Saudis were using this channel to ship their crude oil or polymers or whatever to the maximum extent possible. So this conflict, even if we have MOU between Iran and US actually still intact in place, the conflict between the Saudis and Houthis may result in Bab el-Mandeb closure, which then again will have serious impact on the market. And you have heard about a country called Somaliland. So why is that? Certainly there is a country, Somaliland, only recognized by Israel, and they have separated from Somalia. They are also near this Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and currently Israel is building their military presence in Somaliland, trying to take the control or to be able to better control Bab el-Mandeb Strait. But what does that mean? That means more potential conflict. So conflict is actually not over. And then when we are doing our crude oil projections, trying to think, okay, what will happen if Iran supply is taken out? Actually, Iran supply, if you have seen at that slide, Iran exports of energy were quite limited, and also petrochemicals, and they were mostly going to China. So after years of sanctions, Iran production is actually just around minimal, let's say. And but actually Iraq, after the Iraqi war, so Iraq production have ramped up and reached almost 5 million barrels a day, which is actually 5% of the global supply. And when whatever was happening between Iran and the US, if you remember, you could have read reports that, okay, there are things happening in Iraq as well. And even now, when we have the funeral of the Iran supreme leader, the funeral will take place in 5 locations, 2 of which are in the Shia holy places in Iraq. So again, what is our interest here? We have to monitor what will happen with Iraq, because Iraq is actually, any reduction in exports from Iraq are actually really a serious, will have serious impact on the global supply and demand. And Kurdistan, that's not like Somaliland. That country does not exist, but some let's say countries would like Kurdistan to exist. Okay, I'm not entering whether they have their own interests, because if Kurdistan exists, that means that Turkey, Iraq, and Syria and Iran are both weakened at the same time, because they all have significant Kurdistan populations in their territories. As a matter of fact, if you remember, one of the ideas of changing the regime in Iran was that Kurdish rebels will enter from Iraq and eventually help start the popular uprising. And so this conflict remains. Palestine, I think, definitely is the conflict that remains, just that somehow it doesn't have, I mean, for good or for bad reasons, I mean, for better or for worse, Palestine conflict is not making that impact on the global crude oil markets. Otherwise, maybe it would be resolved faster, right? And then OPEC is minus UAE. So even then the other days, OPEC say, look, we will increase our output. What is the meaning of that? One thing is they can increase output, but whether Saudis will be able to ship it and whether Russians will be able to increase the output in the environments where a lot of their facilities are being bombed daily, that's really an important question. And NATO is, of course, military alliance, but actually, whatever is happening with NATO will have direct impact on the supply of, let's say, crude oil and gas from Russian Federation. And so whether this is, again, I will mention it later, but so other than the Hormuz, what we are seeing right now, there are lots of facilities being damaged in Iran, Iraq, in Ukraine and Russian Federation conflict. And Malaysia have just signed an agreement that there will be Russian energy and feedstocks supplied to Malaysia and also long-term supply of gas from Turkmenistan. But this really may come into question depending on what is the level of damage done to Russian production sources. And there was a question that we received actually before the seminar. Somebody wrote, okay, what's the impact of all this damage to refineries and other production facilities and petrochemical plants? So interestingly, let's say Iranians have fired some missiles which really have damaged, let's say, plants in Qatar, in Bahrain, in UAE, etc. But I would say these were all fixed, or most of it will be fixed. And those companies, once they are hit, they can announce force majeure. It is not necessarily in their interest to say how big or how small the hit was, because any hit that happens was actually increasing the pricing. And if you're selling crude oil and if you sell 10 million barrels at 50, or if you sell 7 million barrels at 100, obviously you make much more money if you sell 7 million barrels at 100. So, and all the US bombings of Iran, somehow they did not really damage much. And my assumption is because they were planning to take over. So why damage Iranian facilities when we are quickly going to take it over and then we are going to use it? But what's happening right now, the damage is, okay, so there is damage in Qatar, there is damage in UAE, etc. The biggest damage would be if the production wells, the crude oil wells are closed on longer term basis. But what's happening right now, there is a full-scale warfare between Ukraine and Russian Federation, which may result in even more Russian facilities being damaged. And actually, that would be a big impact because, again, if let's say let's just round it up, if global consumption of crude oil is 100 million, and if Russia is doing 10 million, so Russia is 10 million of that supply. So if 3 millions are out of market or 4 millions out of market, then obviously that has a significant impact, right? And so now we are talking about, so before the impact, I mentioned there was a surplus of crude oil. So basically there was almost nothing that could damage the surplus, meaning that even if you have Iran taken out 1-2 million barrels, there is still surplus of crude oil. Even if you have Libya not functioning, there is still surplus of crude oil. So surplus was in the range of 5 to 10 million if you count in the reserve and spare capacities that Saudis were not using. Saudis have 2 million of spare capacities, etc. And then this is what we have made in April. And the most recent one I haven't included, but we can share with you. I think I will email all of you. And what happens is somebody asked, okay, now the Hormuz is closed. How come the prices are going down? Actually, for a lot of these, one thing is there is an issue with the physical supply, or those are, let's say, not the actual prices that deals are made. The main issue is the sentiment and the speculators. So the moment that speculators think the conflict is over, whoever has taken some positions they will try to get rid of the stock. So if I have expensive stock and I see that it's going to decrease, I just want to sell it as quickly as I can. And this is one of the reasons that we see reduction in prices. But if somebody is, if what is my opinion? If somebody asks me, okay, is the crisis over? No, the crisis is ongoing. So this is ongoing crisis. I see that while we have this relative ceasefire between Iran and US, we are not going to have this lasting much longer. And my expectation is that we will have the next sequence. I mean, what will happen in November or December will be that the full scale, the third attempt between Iran, Israel, and US will be started. And what's the reason? I'm not saying is because US government, everybody has a different interest. So let's say if from US government perspective or President Donald Trump, probably the interest is to open the Trump Tower in Tehran and to actually start working with Iran. And Iran is a big potential market, 100 million people, and US companies could operate in Iran. It could help to have stabilize the world crude oil supply. So I think the ideal case for actually US interest would be to really work with Iran. If you read the MOU carefully, part of the agreement is that, or part of removal of sanctions is that Iran is allowed, first time after many, many years, to sell their crude oil cargoes in US dollars. So whatever Iran was selling, they were selling to China and they were not selling in US dollars. And now these sanctions have actually backfired because multiple countries which are under sanctions, they start using alternative currencies or alternative payment systems. So the agreement right now is that Iran is free to sell using US dollars to any country in the world, at least for the next 60 days. So that is from the perspective, from the US. From the perspective of Iran, I don't think they really want to have a long-term conflict with the United States. I think just with the United States itself, they could actually really sign and implement the agreement and actually have some type of relationship which is to mutual interest. But it is Israel that definitely is not going to allow Iran, or try not to allow Iran to remain a significant power in the region. I'm not going to go much into what Saudis or somebody else wish or think about this, but the countries that really has a lot of say, like it or not, is Israel, and I don't see that they will allow Iran that has some nuclear enrichment capabilities or have some missiles to stay as it is, as long as they can have their way. So there are elections in Israel in October. Every day I read 3 Israeli newspapers to see the sentiment across the board in left and right Israeli newspapers is that, okay, they want to continue dealing with Iran. And so elections in Israel is October, midterm elections in US is November. So then we expect the restart in December. And by then everybody's rearming or trying to recalculate their capabilities and so on. So is it over? No, it is not over. So what is the purpose of this slide? The purpose of this slide is to show there is a strong correlation. Why are we talking about crude oil? And we are actually discussing petrochemicals. There is a strong correlation between the crude oil and naphtha and pricing, etc. And of course, we are using naphtha to get more than ethylene, but we have just shown that a lot of companies are switching to ethane, which of course limits them primarily to making polyethylene. And so how do low oil prices impact investment landscape? Let me just see if I'm on time. I think I'm on time. So we'll run until 3:15, then we have like a Q&A, and then we'll answer all the questions. I'm actually getting something on the WhatsApp, but I will not be looking at the WhatsApp right now. So again, if we have low crude oil prices, then there is no initiative for companies like Petronas or with shale oil gas producers in US to actually keep expanding their production. And everybody is now going for ethane, right? Actually, just to let you know, I mean, I'm using some slides and trying to summarize in 1.5 hours what we normally do, at least in 1 day conference or 2 day conference. So in this case, US shale boom provided a huge ethane supply, but at the low crude oil prices, which are in range of the 50, actually, shale oil producers, they are not interested to invest because the tier one investments, which are very, very profitable, are mostly taken up. And now you are talking about tier two investments, which need at least 60 or 70 US dollar per barrel to actually break even. So what is I mean, what is happening? Even President Trump was hoping there will be huge investments and all that. Is it not really moving that fast? Same like investments in Venezuela are not moving that fast because companies need to see an outlook where the crude oil price may remain at a higher level longer term, right? So this, everybody like PTT, SEG in Thailand, they're saying they're going to switch to ethane. My question would be, are there really enough ethane for everybody? Because if everybody wants to use ethane, there may not be enough ethane. And talking about Canada, like Canada is another country with a huge reserves, but since Canada was mostly supplying by pipe to US, they never really bothered to build that many facilities. But if you remember, there was a Petronas investment, or supposedly supposed to be Petronas investment in LNG in Canada. Then somehow that didn't really work out. I will not go into details. And so there are some LNG terminals, but let's put it this way: the majority of whatever Canada was producing, whether from sand, soil, or whatever, was actually moving by pipe to US. So why do I mention this? Because in this changing world, that Canada doesn't want to be 52nd province of the United States. Canada is saying, look, we are going to ramp up our investment, but how fast that can happen? But they have to build infrastructure first because their current infrastructure is not supporting big exports, and all of that requires investments, right? And again, Russian Federation rejoined the global trade, so this is the big question mark because assuming that Russian Federation can pump whatever they have, then we are looking at the global oversupply, right? But once we have Russian Federation, some part of it taken out or some part from other countries that I'm mentioning, then we will reach that balancing of crude oil supply and demand quite faster. And then any disruption will actually really bring the prices up. So I'm just sharing this with you. What are we looking at from now until end of next year? We are looking at constant rebalancing, crisis after crisis, etc. And this unlocking existing Middle East crude oil and gas for global markets, yeah, if Saudi Arabia can build up their solar capacity, if Iranian can build up their nuclear capacity, then we are going to have much more of that available for exports, right? Very big thing today. So I'm including this slide again because we are going to come to Malaysian 3.9, and all of these slides are meant to be used when we are having discussion about Malaysia 3.9. So since basically President Trump came to power, the focus has shifted from climate focus and renewables to geopolitics focus shift towards survival, right? And I just want to make a point immediately. By January 29, sustainability is going to come back. So when we have this discussion today and whatever like plans we are making, we should actually continue looking at sustainability. And whatever we say about Europe, EU is talking about sustainability and continuing. And let's say talking even about China, I will just share with you, we got inquiry for the project where European company wants to know what are the greenhouse emissions for China PP and PET producers. So actually, it is still alive, and European companies, they are still investing and actually paying for projects. So to be able to report before they actually include Chinese PP or PET in their supply chains, to be able to understand what will be impact on their sustainability rating. And this is going to come into much bigger play the moment, let's say, we have a change in White House 2 years from now. So, but today geopolitics is the main driver, and we will see a lot of disruption and being played out. And of course, the reason is President Trump doesn't believe in the institutions and global and international institutions, which actually U.S. was one of the primary architects of the global system that he's trying to break down today, right? So now this long-term partnership and commitments define long. I mean, the recommendation would be that you keep building your relationships and do what is in the best interest of your company or your country. And even though this is for Malaysian players, I actually do make same. I mean, if I'm in Manila, I recommend the same thing to players in Manila, right? So EU side. So I can't elaborate enough, but if I talk to my associates in Europe, etc., but I use this. This is from INEO's website, and INEO's chairman wrote a couple of letters to Europe. But this is one of the letters trying to get the regulators, Europe, to actually change whatever rules they were making, because they are bringing the European petrochemical industry to extinction. And of course, with that, one way or the other, they are also killing the supply chain for so many other industries. And then I can immediately say that the same regulations, even though EU is championing sustainability, but their regulations are making it very difficult for recycling companies in Europe to survive. So basically, they are really, and of course, once you are exposed to the markets, then European converters are having trouble surviving. And the only positive news for you would be that U.S. polyethylene is down to zero duty, import duty, custom duty from U.S. to EU from the 1st of July, which will also have impact in us. So I'm mentioning that as one of the good news. So quick screenshots, we just run through the news. SABIC exiting Europe, right? INEOS writing letters, we can't survive. ExxonMobil shutting in Singapore, shutting in France, and then starting in Texas. So what we are having now with this U.S. polyethylene duty, we will, and actually these are all news. You can see the day it's happening before, but this is the pattern. So Exxon will supply polyethylene from the United States with zero duties, and they have actually shut their facilities in Europe. And just talking about the very cheap ethane and the cheap ethylene, does that mean that you automatically are doing super well? But if you look at Sasol, it doesn't mean that. And if you look at the Westlake, even having the cheapest ethylene in the world, Westlake has adjusted their capacities in US downwards. And then what about China? Pumping. China has actually achieved record surplus in the last year. And the reason I'm mentioning this news, because later on we'll discuss how can Malaysia adopt China model, right? And talking about sanctions, I want to actually just say one thing. So by imposing sanctions, let's say on Russian Federation, US have really benefited China, because then it is China that is able, I mean, when you talk about Europe and China and US, so enabling sanctions and bombing the Nord Stream on the Russian supplies, EU is now exposed to more expensive supplies from overseas, including from US. So EU is obviously not benefiting from this. But then the main real competitor for US is actually China. But what is US doing? They are sanctioning Russians, who then have no choice but to sell at much lower price to China. So China is benefiting from the cheapest energy and the feedstock due to the sanctions imposed by US. So you are literally helping your peer competitor to grow and strong. And then anybody else that is competing with China has to take into account that China is actually the one benefiting from the cheapest energy and the feedstock. And what was the reason EU was doing so well for so many years, up to 22 anyhow, when the Ukraine conflict started? Because they were benefiting from the piped unbeatably priced Russian gas, right? So further hit, I mean, how they say insult to adding insult to injury, right? I mean, so it's the European company that was supposed to start their sustainable plastics plants in Europe, and they gave up last minute and they actually opened in China. So this is, I mean, what regulations can do. I mean, you can use this slide as an example. I mean, we are talking about sustainability on one hand for EU, but then we are having regulations which are making it possible for sustainable plastics plant to be run in EU, and then it's moving to China. And then we are saying, oh, why is China benefiting, right? And then, okay, tax rebates, you can skip that. And of course, BASF, the German major, where are they opening their new steam cracker? They are, of course, opening it in China. So why? Because the regulatory environment and the market and everything is in China. So we are talking about restructuring. And again, this is all about like giving you this introduction before we come to Malaysia 39. So there's ongoing change, ongoing restructuring. So Shell Bupcom taken over by Chandra Asri, CP Chem plant in Singapore taken over by Chandra Asri. So actually Chandra Asri, they wanted to have the integration up to the point that they can actually secure naphtha, they can secure cheaper feedstock, etc., so they can be more competitive. Compared to JG Summit case, which actually has shut down in Philippines in the last year, shut down their PP&P production. Then we talk about Longsong project in Vietnam, originally like naphtha based or whatever, then shut down for a while until they built the ethane tanks and start importing ethane and etc. Then I already mentioned Exxon shutting here and there. And talking about restructuring, so SABIC or Saudi Aramco or SABIC, whichever have exited EU, then you have just read the news that Prevchem Saudi Aramco made an exit. And again, I mentioned SABIC because SABIC was the one marketing 50% of the petrochemical product from Prevchem. Sumitomo Petro Arabic is no longer marketed by Sumitomo Chemical. Borouge and Borealis have merged and they are becoming a Borouge International, and so on and so on and so on, right? So a lot of restructuring. And now Malaysia. So Malaysia, and this is up to end of 24, actually is becoming a net energy importer. And okay, on this sense, like recent Malaysian government action to actually negotiate long-term supply of Russian Federation competitively priced energy and feedstock cargoes, I think that's a step in the right direction. Every country should eventually do something for its own benefit. And you can't, let's say, protecting your own industry will not really work unless you make sure your own industry actually also has the same level playing field like other countries. So if you want to compete with China, then you should have the same energy and feedstock inputs that China has, right? So that's about Malaysia energy, right? Then we talked about Philippines, and I will actually tell you a quick story about Philippines, and this is something that Malaysia doesn't want to do, so I'm including Philippines. So in Philippines, there were actually import duties on the raw materials, on PPOP, etc., but there were no import duties on the plastic end products. And what happened? And that was done to protect local producers at that time, Petron and JG, and they actually had different names at that time, and the owners. And what happened is when this happened, Filipino companies, they actually, like San Miguel, have opened their plants in Malacca, in Malaysia. So they imported plastic end products because there was no duty on plastic end products, and there was a duty on raw materials. Then Philippine converters, they have shrank significantly up to the point that then producers of polymers lost their markets because their market in the Philippines have shrank. Then they have shut down, and over the years they had ups and downs and so on, and came to the point that JG Summit shut down last year, PP&P, and Petron still has propylene, FCA propylene 250,000 ton, but they choose to mix it for fuels because that makes more money than feeding it to polypropylene plants. So now the Philippines is fully import for the raw materials for PPMP and of course still imports a great deal of plastic end products. So this is what's happening in Philippines. Now, looking at the Russian Federation, and of course, we start from 91 with the demise of the Soviet Union, different production. But what I have mentioned, all of this Russian production and etc., will depend on what's happening, whether refineries and other facilities are being hit. And then we are now at 3 o'clock, and we start Malaysia 3-9, and we will do this for 15 minutes, and then let's go for Q&A. So when you look at the 3-9, Malaysia as a whole, that means plastic and raw materials 3901 to 3907, and plastic and products 3917 to 3926, 3915, which is scraps, whatever. So let's say the whole of 39, Malaysia seems to be balanced, but it has actually, end of 25, moved to the point where it's important. And it's actually a big thing for Malaysia because depending on what the raw material price is, etc., you can see this 21, 22, actually, when the lines are, it's reaching $10 billion for imports and $10 billion for exports. And this is based on Malaysian statistics. Now, why Hager score 3.9 matter? Let's say what's happening right now in China and Vietnam. We actually have not only China. What I was showing is, and what I was saying previously, let's say China is booming. Then there were some sanctions or dumping duties on China. They have moved some of the production to Vietnam. So both China and Vietnam are now enjoying very, very strong ecosystem. Actually, it's not even a supply chain, it's ecosystem. So if you need to purchase anything, you can actually easily do it. You can easily find, so it can be semi-product, it can be end product, it can be anything, but because the ecosystem is strong, there are many manufacturers, you can start doing whatever you wish to do in both China and Vietnam. When I look at the Vietnam data, right? I mean, it's just amazing. It's impossible to even download the data because it's millions and millions of rows. I mean, it's growing tremendously, and Vietnam is really a big beneficiary. I mean, other than China, the second biggest beneficiary is Vietnam, and not to mention that Vietnam has a free trade agreement with EU, right? So my proposal is, I mean, my thinking is that Malaysia can consider China and Vietnam success model and is the next in line, and being even smaller in size can truly benefit. And it is actually benefiting, but we will discuss how to make sure that this continues, right? Then you have that second case, which is widely accepted, that EU regulations are shrinking the plastics industry, producers, converters, and recyclers. And there is this 1st of July 2026 zero duty for USP, which again means you will depend on new imports from US, right? And then we are looking at that Philippines case, which I have already elaborated. I also want to point out the Taiwan case. So Taiwan has built huge petrochemicals industry, many producers, and whoever is buying PVC every month, somehow everybody is still waiting for Formosa to announce the price, and before they announce their price for PVC. But how did Formosa become so important for PVC? Because originally the petrochemical industry in Taiwan was built to support Taiwan converters. But over the years, due to the cost, due to different issues, most of these converters have actually moved out to Vietnam or shut down. And then the net export availability from Taiwan actually had to find its home somewhere else. So Taiwan is actually a huge net exporter. And the reason for that is that because the local converting industry have shrunk. I am bringing this case up because, let's say, if Malaysian producers If Malaysian converters will eventually shrink, then Malaysian producers will have to export even more than what they do now. So it is in nobody's interest long term that any part of the chain is actually damaged. You need to have producers, you need to have converters, you need to have everybody. And I'm not saying this because I'm trying to be politically correct, right? So this is what's happening in Philippines, this was happening in Taiwan. And then when we look at the prices, right? So we can see that the prices have almost doubled, like let's say in 26 and so on. And but still, the total imports and exports of plastic and product remain the same. That means the total imports and exports have actually shrunk in March and April this year. And that means a lot of inventories, etc., are being depleted. And then we move to the key slide, which is actually where I want maybe Q&A and discussion to start. You see, so when we look at the whole 3.9, then it's, let's say, balanced for Malaysia imports and exports. But when we actually split it into plastic resins and plastics and products, we can see that over the years, that actually Malaysian production or value of production, because the prices are changing. So we are not talking about volume here. We are just looking at the value. So we are able to compare it apple to apple. It's, we are seeing that Malaysia is both importing and exporting plastic resins, which has always been the case. So this has been the case regardless of Hormuz. I mean, actually, if you go back to 1990, I mean, since we had first capacities in Malaysia, I mean, it has always, Malaysia was always both both importer and exporter of plastic resin. But what has happened with the plastic end products, actually, the value of Malaysian exports remained somewhere in that range, 3.5 to 4 billion USD, while the value of the imports, the plastic end products imports have actually increased and finally overtaken the exports in end of 25. And we are now in a situation that, Malaysia is in a situation that if this trend continues, that even though in terms of business, some converters may be having the same business, so they may be still doing 1,000 tons, or they may still be selling $1 million US, right? But the total share of the market for Malaysian converters have actually shrank because obviously the imports are more than exports, and then whichever way you look at it, Malaysian converters are already losing the share. And there could be multiple, there are multiple reasons for that, but what few of the things that we wish to discuss today or make some recommendations. It's like we are moving on to conclusions before we open to the questions. Like number one, for regulators, and of course that's the government, which is actually already being done, supply the most competitive energy and feedstocks. So if China or Vietnam are being able to get their inputs, the raw material or energy inputs or feedstocks inputs a certain level, then Malaysia, to be able to compete in the global market, should actually have the same inputs, right? Then there's another thing that is prevalent in Malaysia, that is an issue with the stockists, the distributors of resins and the SST. So in my mind, this needs to be fixed because we are moving from the point where the price was the primary concern. The supply is actually, the security of supply is becoming one of the primary concerns. And then let's say when Hormuz or any other issues is happening, and it's almost guaranteed it will continue happening from now until end of next year, you need to have some inventory buffer. But with the SST issue in place, actually that inventory buffer is not available. And once you have lost this part of supply chain, you are exposed to really wild pricing, or you are exposed to the worst possible case scenario, which is you are unable to produce. You have some orders coming in, but you don't have raw materials, right? And so again, it's a simple thing. If a company from China can sell plastic end products to Malaysia or to Japan based on whatever price of cheap and much cheaper, because Iranians will sell at the bottom price, so the low end of range to China, then if they can sell their plastic end product to Malaysia, then Malaysian companies should also be able to import the same raw material without the duty. Otherwise, you are guaranteed to continue having this trend where Malaysia converters are shrinking, and that will not be lost only to plastics industry, because eventually, whether you are exporting palm oil, whether you are doing paints and you need a pail, etc., there are so many industries, automotive and so on, which are actually really dependent on plastic industry. And once you have the ecosystem, it really enables a lot of things. So let's not for a moment just talk about China. Let's talk about Switzerland. So let's say Switzerland, they are doing a lot of watches, right? So they need a lot of tiny little parts. They need a lot of tiny little machines that can do tiny little things. They need those lubricants. Then, of course, once they need to make artificial heart, which also need the same parts, so it's all available. There is a stockist nearby. I can get some lubricant. There's a machinery guy nearby. I can get this. So the ecosystem is super important. So what China is really doing is building this ecosystem. And what we see now in Vietnam is a very strong ecosystem. And for Malaysia, it has to have ecosystems. And relying on imports leave you in a much worse position. I'm not saying you have to buy locally or you can import or you can do whatever you wish, but you should have a choice to actually to be able to get that locally, whatever you want to get locally, and you should have a level playing field, right? So for the recycle industry, I have mentioned that, okay, EU is becoming a bigger and bigger opportunity. So number one, I think for regulators, for Malaysian government, enable FTAs, not just with EU, but all the key markets. In the future, sooner or later, the conflicts with Ukraine is going to be over, and Russian Federation is 150 million people. I mean, that's actually quite important market. And in the past, that market, Russian Federation used to buy a lot from EU, but since now the relationships are sore, that's an opportunity for Malaysian companies. So there was a question, what are the opportunities for Malaysian companies? So EU is opening up. I mean, since they are shrinking in so many ways, they are going to rely on imports. And there is actually even this part where some EU companies prefer not to buy from China. And okay, they're buying from Vietnam. But why not Malaysia? Why not buy more from Malaysia, right? So, and to be able to achieve that, these regulations in Europe, I mentioned, we are still getting clients and having a budget to pay for sustainability, right? And they want to know, and they need to know, and they are big brand names. So for them, that is still important. So penetrating EU more, Malaysia hopefully should have strong recycling industry, because whatever you're shipping to Europe, one way or the other, you will need to show that your recycled content, your sustainability, etc., everything is covered, right? So, okay, I mean, this is, I think recyclers are facing a lot of headwinds, but it's really important to make recyclers survive, because it will be necessary, again, as a part of ecosystem to be able to sell to EU. And again, EU market, EU imports, I just expect them to grow. And then talking about the voice, and it's not this competition, the voice. I mean, who's going to sing the best, right? But like to advocate to the regulators of Malaysian governments, okay, you have MPMA, and actually, like there are associations in other countries as well, but and we have customers everywhere. So I would say that for MPMA is much more actively involved than association in Philippines or association, I don't know. I mean, these guys also trying to do their best, but they are not as strong or as capable in having the industry voice heard as MPMA. But now the voice is, like I mentioned, the whole ecosystem is to give the voice to MKMA. So it's no longer about plastic converters. I mean, it's about recyclers, about stockists, about including polymers producers. It's actually in their interest that Malaysia ecosystem, including converters, including recyclers, actually remain as strong as possible. So it's a big danger in a way that we have reached this point where, for the first time in many years, actually, like the plastic end products are being exported less than they're imported. And actually, it's probably the trend is even happening in 26 and will be happening quite fast going forward. So that's the end of my prepared remarks. It's 3:15 as discussed. So I would like to open the webinar, right, to the questions. And I don't know which way we are going to look at the questions. And okay, so thank you. That's this part. Assessments welcome you. And okay, I will stop sharing my screen, right? Francis, I stop sharing my screen, okay? You can have your slide, right? For the Q&A.
Nick, that was an excellent presentation. Well done. Well done.
Thank you. And I did it so fast, forgetting to drink my coffee, right?
And yeah, I love your cartoon graphics. It really nuances what the title of each slide was. So beautiful. I just simply love your graphics.
Yes, thank you. We didn't make it with AI. This is actually made by Illustrator previously, I mean, and we didn't use
Good
AI.
job. That's fantastic. Okay, Nick, now for the Q&A part, I understand that there were some questions that were sent to you.
Yeah, actually, I have tried to cover some of them as a part of the discussion, right? But so let's say uh, the Strait of Hormuz is closed, but why is crude oil price going down? Again, I have answered that question is due to the sentiment, right? The moment uh, speculators, because there's still a lot of money. I mean, obviously, this is a great opportunity to make a lot of money. So if you're holding a stock, or if you purchase some cargoes, or if you are actually driving a hard bargain, and then you see, okay, they are really going to have peace deal signed or ceasefire signed, then you want to get rid of that stock. So that this stocking on the speculators part is obviously what will bring the prices down. And then you can expect adjustments back, because eventually we are still looking at shortage along the supply chain. The slides we have looked at, you see the value of imports and exports for 3.9 for March and February is the same. Or I don't know if it's including this slide, but let's say the value is the same, but the price, of course, is double. It means that imports and exports in March and April have actually shrank. They have stopped. So for a lot of companies, I don't know, palm oil exporters, they may were not able to export to their clients, which were affected by the Hormuz or shipping or the shipping, whatever. And now they did not order HDP bottles, they did not order plastic packaging. And then sooner or later, they need to restock. And when they restock, they will quickly look, okay, I need HDP, I need packaging, and this restocking will cause the prices to go up again. So if somebody asks me, okay, what's the bottom? Actually, we are going to hit some bottom, then it's going to continue to fluctuate, and this will really be truly challenging. And it's not over. So it's in my mind, the conflict will really continue more seriously in November or December. But in the meantime, those tiny conflicts are just simmering and have from time to time are going to explode to become actually up to the point that talking about the supply. So if Russian, let's say, refineries are being hit, and they are really being hit by drones made in Poland, and the conflict, we keep saying conflict is between Ukraine and Russian Federation, but actually conflict is between NATO and Russia. Just that openly NATO is not sending their soldiers, but all the supply of the weapons and drones and that are hitting actually Russia is coming from Europe. So in terms of even legal context, Russians have the right to strike the factory of the military drones in Poland. Then that will actually really bring conflict to the whole new level, right? And I expect that things will get worse before they get better. So that's answer to that. So okay, again, for the refinery, Iran was not damaged that much because US was planning to use it. So that's the same. If you look at the lot of wars, somehow this nicest area of the city never gets damaged in fighting. So whenever if you read the history, so you look at, I know, Battle for Belgrade. So after the Battle for Belgrade, that is 1939, 1945, that area where all the top mansions are, that never gets damaged. I have never seen bombed mansion in some of these big cities. Why? Because whoever takes over won't utilize it. And same thing goes for the facilities. So US plan, they were thinking they will settle Iran case in 1 month and then take over the facilities. So they did not damage any facilities. But Iran did damage some other facilities. I mean, when they were responding to US military bases and all that. So I'm trying to be diplomatically correct to use all the. So the biggest damage is happening right now inside Russian Federation because the whole Ukrainian strategy is to damage all the supply chains for Russian Federation, and then if that is happening, then Russian Federation may have less exports, and then that will impact the supply. And then there's this very interesting question. China has been taking opportunity to continue exporting, and in a way, China has provided a buffer, which is actually true, because I purposely today didn't want to talk so much about China, but China has overbuilt on the raw materials. They have overbuilt. China, in their goal to become self-sufficient, they have much exceeded their self-sufficiency needs, and basically they have really built enough to supply their whole One Belt, One Road, their whole ecosystem, meaning to export to Pakistan, to Bangladesh, to wherever they see their big potential markets, right? But the very important thing to understand, whatever prices China was able to sell to let's say Malaysia, to Southeast Asia, was based on the cheap feedstock that they are able to get from, let's say, Russian Federation, or cheap ethane, but it's still more expensive than US ethane that they are getting from US. And long term, China doesn't have natural, I mean, China has coal, but even coal is coming to the point of being insufficient in China. So China has a huge demand for all the natural resources. So in my mind, China is not competitive supplying the raw materials to, let's say, Southeast Asia long term, depending on what the price of the crude oil, or what is the price of ethane, or what is the availability of ethane or propane. Saudis also are coming up with some ethane and so on. So this feedstock challenge for China, in my mind, will really prevent them from competing globally. Let's say, how does China compete with Saudi Arabia that has the cheap feedstock? I mean, in terms of raw materials, no, it cannot compete. So primarily the capacities were built to feed China, and now there is a temporary, let's say, oversupply. And okay, Chinese companies are happy to export to Southeast Asia. Can they do so long term? Not really, not on a competitive level, because they still depend on the imported feedstocks. So it's the same, like South Korea is facing the problem because they depend on the imported feedstocks. China has really managed to benefit from piling up a lot of strategic reserves at very low prices from Iran, from Russian Federation over the last 3-4 years. Whether they will be able to continue to have those very cheap feedstock and energy supplies, we will see. So that's another question, and I think that's it. And then, okay, how to start exporting? So any training on how to start exporting? I mean, actually, like I think there are lots of support available. So for that company, probably MPMA can answer better than me. Same like question, has any of the issue of economics taken up with the government? Okay, MPMA is taking up these issues with the government. So these are all the available questions at the moment. I don't know whether there are further questions. Let me see on the WhatsApp.
Okay, to all our participants this afternoon, are there any questions for Nick? I don't see any in the chat box.
I did it so well. So
Yeah, I think so. Everyone is like, wow, that's a lot of information to digest. Don't know what to ask.
this is digest of the digest. I mean, we will have a conference on 21st August, one day before MPMA Central Dinner. So we are having conference at the same hotel. So that will be the whole day where okay, each topic like ethane will be covered as a separate topic, 30 minutes. I know each feedstock will be covered separately and so on. But so this is the selected slides to try to share like what's really happening right now at this point in time.
Nice, nice. Okay, very good. Okay, any questions from the floor? Any questions from any of the participants? If there's none, are there none? I don't see anything going on in the chat box. Okay.
Okay, Francis, I have to say something. If there are no questions from the floor at the moment, you can write to MPMA and we will put you in touch with Nick. Or Nick, can you send your email in the chat box?
Ah,
Yeah. So if anyone has questions, then they can email directly to Nick and he will help to answer any of those questions. Thank you, Francis.
I mean, you can email assessments.com or anyhow, I think NPMA will share the slides later, or I can share the slides, and we can. Okay, we will be very happy if you to answer if you have further questions, or you join us on 21st August and listen to the whole day deep dive into each of the topics we covered today.
Please send us the graphic and the EDMs for that seminar, Nick, and we will blast it out to our members.
Okay. I will send you the PDF file.
Okay, with that, I'd like to sincerely thank Nick for his great presentation this afternoon at our webinar. And to ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to wish you a good day. Have a safe journey back home this evening. Nick, once again, thank you.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you, MPMA. Thank you, everybody.
Bonita, if you can hear me, can you please put on the music? Thank you, Bonita.